So, last year I played Wild Arms, or Waldo as apparently YouTube thinks I call it, for the first time. Getting my first exposure to the world of Filgaia and MediaVision's interesting take on JRPG combat with adventure-like overworld mechanics. And I absolutely fell in love. It was one of those games that interested me from early on, and after a few hours, I became absolutely enthralled with. I appreciated the combat system, really liked the use of tools to add to exploration, really enjoyed the setting, despite not being someone absolutely mad about Wild West, and found the characters and plot to be really engaging. So naturally, I was pretty keen on the sequel. When I was doing research for my video on the first game, I had seen there was some negative stuff, and that it faced the same fate as the first one of being marginalized due to other bigger games. But that didn't really deter me. I'm someone who likes to get their opinion independently, and would actually like to disagree with what would seem to be the consensus opinion, if possible. I mean, the premise of my video for the first one was what a shame it was that it got sidelined by Final Fantasy VII. So I kept my optimism heading in, and ended up a little bit disappointed. No more preamble, let's talk about why. So, let's start off with the positives and talk about the things the game got right. Because there really is quite a few. First and foremost, presentation. I love this graphic style. While the first game was only 3D in battles, Wild Arms 2 is full-blown 3D in all areas, with the ability to rotate their environments as you move around in them. And it just looks great. The pixel sprites of the characters blend in really well with the environments, and it's just a style that ages very well. In the combat, the characters are better detailed and more emotive, just giving them a little bit more personality. The enemies as well, they are more animated and show better reactions to attacks. Though I do have to say, screw these bloody dogs here. Their recoil animation seems a bit out of sync, so every time you hit them, it looks like they're actually dodging. And some of these creatures are overly dramatic ponces as well. Anyway, there are also areas where you have weather effects in the battles. But if I was to pick out an area which is a little bit disappointing, it is that the backgrounds for the encounters are still a bit bare and uninteresting. When it comes to being out in the open world, I wasn't a fan at first, but over time I did really come to appreciate it. My initial problem was the change in perspective. I thought that the top-down view of the first game really added to the atmosphere. That restrictive view, leaving you just being able to see terrain, really gave a feeling of being out in the wilderness. So I didn't really want to see that being lost. But then I realized that it was more a problem of the first area just being very small. So later, when I reached larger parts of the map, the over-the-shoulder view really does actually give a vibe of adventuring out into sprawling wildlands. Amplified by this new view giving verticality to the map, with mountains and hills being clearly present. And it's also nice to have forests, grasslands and snow meshing into the plains instead of being segmented onto separate continents. On a more minor note, the UI for the combats and normal menus is also just cleaner and easy to use. So on the subject of presentation, we have a definite improvement. Let's check on one of the more important matters. You see, I don't always have to talk about combat first. Sometimes I can do it second. There won't be too much on this one here, because it's mostly the same as the first, but just with a few tweaks. Which is fine, I liked it before, but I'm also not opposed to some adjustments. And for me, these adjustments are either good or a variation which I don't think detracts from the combat to make it worse. Starting with the most impactful is that we no longer have mana for mage characters. Along with the force bars, all characters now have force points. And abilities and spells need a certain amount of force points to be used. As before, force points are built up during the course of battle, but with a slight difference. Importantly though, the abilities themselves don't actually use those force points. You just have to have that many to be able to use said abilities. So, let's say for example, High Flame needs 48 force points. As soon as you have that amount, you can cast it as many times as you like. So, you can't just nuke the entire battlefield from the off, but once you're in rhythm, you don't need to drop down to shooting Piffle all of a sudden because you decided to cast Chaos Cannon. But it's not as easy to build up the force bar anymore, because casting spells and using abilities do not do so. Only being hit and standard attacks do. And of course, the special force abilities do drain that bar as well. So, while I don't think there was anything wrong with the MP method of the previous, I appreciate this variation, and I think it's pretty well balanced for its implementation. And it does also work for two reasons we're going to get onto now. The first being the introduction of personal skills. When leveling up, the characters get skill points which can then be used to purchase passive buffs. These include things like increasing the chance of countering or getting criticals, added resistance to status effects, increased stats when going up force levels, increasing the base force points they start the battle with, or lessening the amount of force points needed for spells and abilities. And it's just a nice addition which gives a bit more party customization. And the second, which is probably more notable, we now have more party members. The first three that we start with exist predominantly as recreations of the predecessors, even having a lot of the force abilities being similar. But then we get Canon, the bounty hunter, who has been genetically enhanced and has her attacks based on gadgets. And if you attack with them, you have a chance of learning new ones. And all of her force abilities tie into this. Each one of her gadget attacks is associated with a gadget level. And when choosing a force ability associated with said level, you can choose which one will be used at the end of an extended combo. Next, well, not actually next because we get him before Canon, but anyway, we have Tim, the Zoa Priest.
Greetings, Tim the Enchanter.
He has the ability to commune with the Guardians, and so most of his force abilities are associated with that. A bit like Cecilia from the first game. But he has some important distinctions. Number 1, his first force ability allows him to share his force points with the rest of the party. Second, while most of the rest of the party can summon as well, they can't do so without Tim being present. And thirdly, while he does cast magic, it isn't learned in the crest sorcery manner of Cecilia in the first, or Lilka in the second. Instead, he learns his from the Guardians. You equip ruins, or mediums as they call in this one, as per the previous, in order to be able to summon a Guardian. But with Tim, he also learns from the equipped medium. After defeating enough enemies, he learns an attack associated with the element of said enemy. Actually, it's 2. Don't make the same mistake I did. He learns another one after enough kills, which I only realized much later, and so had to go back and do some medium rearranging. And lastly, we have Marival, the Crimson Noble, the secret character who can be found, who has the ability to cast Red Law. Do you get the reference? She's a blue mage, who has the ability to use skill drain to learn new abilities from enemies. So, we have more party members, which obviously just leads to having some more diversity in the battles, which is nice. And you aren't stuck with choosing a party and then having to swap them out back at base or whatever. You have the ability to change party members in the middle of battle. Suck it, Final Fantasy, Wild Arms is better than you. Though, it's definitely not as smooth as in Final Fantasy X, but come on, that's another console generation. Lastly, the thing with combat I want to talk about is the summons, and how much better they are. Firstly, they just look more graphically impressive. Their cutscenes are more detailed, and now looking a bit more on par with what one would come to have expected at this point in gaming. But also, they are more effective. My bigger complaint about them in the first was that the damage they did wasn't anything really special, and so you were better off just using abilities. But now the damage is far more considerable. And they also have the added bonus of giving the person they're equipped to an extra ability, such as a death blow kind of attack, or the ability to pickpocket. There's also something else I really like about them, but we're going to talk about that in the next segment. Firstly, world traversal. As I said, it's already just more interesting with the world being more detailed in terms of environments, verticality, and just having a different perspective. But now there is also different means of traversal which feel different. There's the airship, which can only land on specific platforms, the water Roomba for water traversal, and then later you get the airship, which allows you to land anywhere. However, there's also interactivity with the world map. You now have a scanner with which you press square and identify things on the map, either finding hidden items or locations, or even for plot purposes. In fact, you need to first scan before finding locations, which does sometimes create a bit of a feeling of, how didn't you see this big thing in the first place? But anyway. Initially, it was a bit tedious to just tediously press square every few steps, but this is mitigated later with Canon joining the party and giving you the radar, which actually does indicate whether there's hidden areas or locations. And it does tie into something that I really like: you aren't told directly where to go. Characters give you directions of where you can go based off of actual compass directions. And so you have to use the provided compass to orient yourself. And I really like this. Trusting the players to find things themselves, and it also encourages you to talk to NPCs who can help you plot-wise, but can also direct you to side dungeons as well. Also, kind of related to this, is the communicator, which can be used to remind you of what you're supposed to be doing should you have forgotten. Which honestly is a little bit of a godsend, given back in these days, if you didn't play for 2 weeks, you were just completely lost because you didn't remember where you were going. Though, sometimes maybe it's better not to talk to NPCs. But on to inner exploration. I've spoken about how I liked the Zelda-like dungeons requiring the use of tools in the first game, and it's present here again, but better. Firstly, with the presence of more characters, we invariably get more tools, and so more diversity in the obstacles we need to deal with. But the puzzles associated with them are also just better designed, usually requiring you to use the tools in a smarter way than just use tool to remove obstacle. Though not always, of course. Also, there are more instances of you needing to use multiple tools to get a chest, for example. And there are even instances for side stuff and plot-wise where you're not given the usual indicative object associated with a tool, and instead have to think of which tool is applicable for this situation. But it's not just using tools. Included with now having the ability to push and pull objects, puzzles require you to just pay more attention and actually figure some things out. Including ones needing you to find passwords and then remember that password to be used on a console or something. Also, with the 3D now giving you the ability to rotate the map, you can actually find hidden secret entrances to rooms. And this ties to the other things I like about the Guardians. As in the first games, there are quite a few you can find hidden out in the world. But now you need to solve a puzzle first before you can get to them, which just adds a bit more of a fun dynamic to them. They aren't overly difficult or cerebral, but it just creates a moment that needs to give you a bit of time to think or react quickly. So gameplay wise, we have a pretty marked improvement on ideas introduced in the first, or at the very least, variations which give you something a bit different and don't detract from gameplay. But as I said in the opening, I was disappointed, so let's get on to why. It's all good and well to have good gameplay and exploration. I'm not being flippant here, games should have good gameplay. But dependent on the genre, there are other aspects that need to be considered. For example, I'm sure tight responsive controls and game feel are of the most importance to players of fighting games, but I have seen that they take a good deal of stock in having interesting and fun character designs. On a similar note, as I've spoken about before when it comes to RPGs, a combat system alone isn't gonna get me through a 30+ hour game. I'm sure there are people who can, but I can't really think of any combat which wouldn't get tiring from the amount of battles you're going to be doing over this time span. So, what an RPG needs to have for me is an interesting plot and interesting characters. And if it's not obvious, Wild Arms 2 didn't really satisfy this itch for me. We'll start with characters, because I would argue that is the most important. And I just didn't really find any of them very compelling. Be that the villains, the protagonists, or just the characters we meet along the way. though I found it was for different reasons. Some were due to character arcs, which weren't executed well enough, and others just weren't very interesting. And some a bit of both. We'll do the latter first, because as the description tells, there's not much to say. The archetype for this was Brad. He's that character who has the past of having fought in the Liberation War and now suffers scars from past battles. Now, this is already a pretty generic trope, but that doesn't mean it's bad. Sometimes tropes are repeated because they give you fertile ground to jump off of. And this might have been the case here, but that would actually require him to have any character at all. He's mostly just mute throughout, occasionally interjecting to seem like he's the wizened one with something important to say, but largely it's just blandness. The other one in this group is Ashley, which is the most unfortunate given how much of the core plot is shaped around him. But he's maybe actually more tedious than Brad. By virtue of him being the main character, we get exposed to him a lot more, and so just have to see more things that I did not find very interesting. He has that standard protagonist feature of being like very self-righteous, which again is standard fare, but he never has that arc where he's challenged on it or has to redress what he believes because of circumstances. I mean, he does change his beliefs slightly, but it's never because his frailties or his insecurities actually cause something bad to happen. He just adjusts it because bad things happened in the plot, not really related to anything he deliberately did himself. And the part of him which you would argue adds conflict early on in the game, we'll get to the conflict later on, is also uninteresting. This conflict being his relationship with Marina, in which both sides struggle to properly articulate their feelings for each other. But this is a relationship with no chemistry. And that's because they alone aren't compelling enough. In Final Fantasy VIII, Squall and Rinoa also had a strained relationship in which they struggled to communicate, but this was interesting because for me, they alone had conflicts and frailties which interested me in them in isolation. But we will speak more on this later. For now, we will speak on canon, since I think she is a good transition to the other character problem, as I did find her interesting originally. She actually starts out as an enemy, obsessed with destroying Ashley, which made her relatively interesting, especially in comparison to the other antagonists we were dealing with at the time. But then when she joins the party, she just becomes less so. Maybe Ashley creates a zone of dullness or something. She is still better than most, with her character being that she has cybernetically enhanced herself to create an idealized version of herself so she can suppress trauma from the past. That indeed does sound like an interesting character, but in execution I didn't really find it to be so. But onto the topic of character arcs, that's where Tim comes in. Because he has the setup for a great character, but the execution falls flat. He starts out seemingly just as a random kid, but goes on to discover that he is to be the pillar who will be important for bringing peace to all of Filgaia. Also discovering that in order to do so, he will die. This sounds rich for a compelling character, but we didn't really get that. Okay, more spoiler warnings, because I'm going to annoy some people and make a Final Fantasy X comparison, because I feel like he actually runs pretty parallel to Yuna. She is the chosen summoner who will make the pilgrimage to defeat Sin. She will undergo many trials, and we will discover later in the plot that she will have to die when the time comes to do so. And right there is the important distinction, which makes her more enticing. We will discover. We don't find out that Yuna has to die until a lot later in the plot. She knows it, but we as the audience don't. So we get to experience a character sharing emotions of joy, sorrow, before discovering this fate that weighs down on her. So we get to make a connection. With Tim, him and we discover his fate immediately after he becomes the pillar. The other issue is this scene here. This should be an impactful moment, as Tim wishes for this moment with Colette to last forever. But why this fails is we have no attachment to this character and no sense of stakes. He literally met Colette like 20 minutes ago, so we don't know anything about her, and we haven't yet to discover the sacrifice he has to make either. So the work hasn't really been done to make this an impactful moment. Again, Yuna's big iconic moment comes after like 3/4 of the game, in which the stakes have been ramped up heavily and we formed a connection. But I'm going to give a momentary reprieve from my whining, because there is a character I like. I do really like Velka. She is friendly and empathetic, but also has a tendency to be blunt and tactless, sometimes without really realizing it. And I also like her eccentric stoicism, in which she doesn't let situations overwhelm her, but it's kind of just in a screw it, we'll just see what happens kind of way. She reminds me quite a bit of Selphie from Final Fantasy VIII, but maybe not as abrasive. And her underlying conflict of desperately seeking to match up to the legacy of her sister after she's lost her is actually pretty compelling. But this is helped by the fact that she's already interesting in the beginning without needing to find this underlying issue first. Okay, back to being negative as I complain about the antagonists. They just don't excite me at all. All of Odessa are basically just uninteresting without anything to make them seem threatening or compelling. And we also have another case where we're having an arc not getting enough development and so falling flat. When you defeat the one member, Antenora, she reveals that she's glad that she's going to die because she hates Vincefield, the Odessa leader, after he was responsible for the deaths of the people she cared about. And so she made him love her so that her death would cause him great emotional pain. And this is actually a pretty interesting twist, if not a bit of a contrived plan on her part. But we were given no real insight into this supposed relationship they had developed, so it just felt there. So the characters didn't really grab me, but they also weren't helped by the narrative. Characters and plot go pretty strongly together. A plot which focuses on things like humanity and the strains that existence can place upon the being of a person is likely to be undermined by characters who aren't gripping, for example. But on a similar note, a poorly constructed narrative can go a long way to damaging character growth and leaving them seeming worse than they actually are. And I do think that was a bit of the case here. The plot is quite flaky. The arms unit is formed, initially with the goal of dealing with the rise of monsters threatening the people of Filgaia, before quickly being dedicated to dealing with the threat of the Odessa terrorist group. Okay, simple enough. But the handling of Odessa is very reactionary. Kind of mostly just feeling like, here's your new mission, go there. Oh, that didn't work, let's try this now. Now, this complaint might seem a bit contradictory to the one person who would be seeing this video and also having watched my Gravity Rush video. Because in that video, I lauded the narrative for it being loose, reacting to events on the fly. But the difference is that in Gravity Rush, those events were still constructed in a way that worked off of and highlighted Kat's personality. Something that doesn't really happen here. I mean, there is one thing that gets highlighted regularly, but by the end, I wouldn't necessarily point it out as a positive. I know the trope of people teaming up to use the power of friendship to defeat God is a pretty common one in JRPGs. And I'm not strictly opposed to it. It literally has been responsible for the scene which gave us one of the best tracks that has ever been in the Final Fantasy soundtrack. But I've always defended it from those dismissive of this in that it's used to probe more into the human condition and the concept of community and society. I mean, the notion of people working together to find purpose and meaning in the world is not a bad one. But Wild Arms 2 isn't very subtle about it. The regularity with which we have to stop to have the team tell each other how they're there for each other became a little bit draining, honestly. So I wasn't really enjoying the plot, finding it particularly disheartening because there were moments and ideas that I liked that I feel were ripe for exploitation. And after finishing the whole game and looking back, I'm definitely disappointed because of Upon reaching the second disc, Wild Arms 2 gets pretty damn interesting. After defeating Odessa, we discover that there has actually been an impending demonic threat which has gradually been eating away at the world. And with this revelation, we get a massive shake-up in the game. The cutscene that plays when launching the game has changed, as has the one when closing the game. The overworld theme changes, the sky has become darkened, and the draw distance cut short to give a whole new atmosphere. It's a great twist, which makes the plot more interesting and gives more investment into the characters as well. We have a Final Fantasy VI-esque situation where the party has to undergo severe introspection of what the world means to them and what they want from their lives. Ashley particularly becomes more compelling as we discover that he's infested by the soul of the Demon Lord who endangered the world in the past, and now he must fight to keep this evil contained as he still attempts to fight for what he cares about, with each moment where his emotions getting the better of him gives this evil power and risks it breaking free, culminating in a very impactful moment where in an uncontrollable rage he almost kills Marina. Well, not such an impactful moment, because there is a bit of a problem here. For me, this twist and change up is undermined by two things. First, we'll talk about the actual twist part. I think we can all agree that a twist is pretty reliant on being surprising and unexpected. Now that's the problem here. At the start of the game, we are told that many years ago there was a demon threat which placed the world in extreme peril. But then a girl stood up to become the Sword Magus and banished this evil. Inductees to the new organization that Ashley joins must attempt to lift her sword. And then we don't really hear about this for the rest of Disc 1. So now if you are someone with some rudimentary experience in narrative, you're most likely to think, well, that Sword Magus stuff hasn't really come up for a while. I guess we're going to have to deal with that at some point. I just feel like they could have used the Odessa part to mask the twist better. Like, Odessa could have claimed they are carrying on the legacy of the Sword Magus or something. Then we would think that's how the Sword Magus stuff mentioned at the beginning ties in, and so make the twist more unexpected and impactful. Also, on the note of things not really being spoken about again, Tim's whole thing of being the pillar is really made out to seem like it's going to be very important and integral to the plot, but it doesn't really end up being like that. Anyway, the other factor impacting this twist moment is some of the payoffs that take place in the second disc. Naturally, they're quite reliant on having formed attachment to the characters throughout the course of the narrative. And as I said, I didn't really gel with them. So unfortunately, I didn't get a hit with the narrative and characterization, which is a shame, as there is definitely good stuff amongst it, particularly good commentary on the notion of heroes and the use of them as mere figureheads to be sacrificed for the creation of symbols to withhold certain ideas. But I do feel that it fell into a bit of a trap that can happen with bigger scale. Namely, having more characters can lead to needing to provide more characterization and then can actually dilute characters. And having a more convoluted plot can damage its execution. By Wild Arms 1 having a tighter plot, focused only on 3 characters, it allowed them to be more fleshed out and more compelling. This brings up a question though. If I wasn't really enjoying the plot until I got around 22 hours into the game, why did I keep going? Well, there's a few reasons. The first is that I have an understanding that games of this time didn't have as many opportunities to do characterization through just the continuation of gameplay. Rather, they relied on specific character moments to do more nuanced and fleshed out characterization. So I played on to get to those moments, aided by the fact that there is actually some pretty decent pacing, with the main story dungeons not being too long or tedious. The other was getting characters like Tim, Canon, and Marival, who learn abilities in ways which encourage exploration and experimentation, so added some discovery to the gameplay, which ties into the main motivator. This is something that was pretty much established for me after playing the first game, but the sequel just further reinforced it and delved into it a bit more. The world of Filgaia is just very interesting. MediaVision pretty much created an Ivalice situation where we have a world with a lore, a general geography, and history which can be used to create a variety of basically unrelated scenarios. Compare the roles that the Guardians play in Wild Arms 1, basically vanished and powerless, needing to be restored, to Wild Arms 2, a present force relatively easy to commune with. The existing societies, the first game mostly just being disheveled isolated towns, and Wild Arms 2 being kingdoms with existing treaties and past histories. And a change in attitudes to technology, where the weapons in Wild Arms 1 were seen as evil and ostracized their users from these isolated societies, but in the sequel, the use of guns and explosives is pretty much standard fare. And because of this, I leave Wild Arms 2 with positivity, despite my aforementioned disappointment. While my experience this time didn't hit the spot, I know there's a world out there which is still primed for great moments. So I can still head into Wild Arms 3 with a bit of anticipation and excitement. Not for a while though, because honestly, I am a bit drained with RPGs right now.